When I first bought the house, I thought I had stumbled onto a hidden gem. It wasn't the biggest house on the block, but it was mine. A cozy little two-bedroom place with a wide front yard, a modest backyard, and enough charm to make me feel like I finally had a home worth settling into. I poured my savings into it, imagining cookouts, summer evenings on the porch, and maybe even starting a family there someday. The neighborhood itself looked perfect on paper-neat lawns, trimmed hedges, and a community clubhouse with tennis courts and a pool. At first glance, it was exactly the kind of suburban dream I had always wanted. What I didn't realize was that behind the white fences and polite smiles lurked the monster we all know too well, the Homeowners Association. It didn't take long before I felt their presence. I'd barely moved in when a letter appeared in my mailbox, the HOA logo bold at the top. I figured it was a welcome letter. Instead, it said my house looked out of character for the neighborhood. According to them, the home was too small compared to the surrounding properties and might negatively affect property values. I stared at that letter, confused and angry. Too small. How was that even my fault? I hadn't built the house, it had been here for decades. The realtor never mentioned it was some kind of issue. Yet here I was, being told by a board of strangers that my home was a problem. The next HOA meeting confirmed my fears. I walked in, sat at the back, and listened as the president, a woman named Karen, yes, that was really her name, brought up my house as an agenda item. She stood at the podium, her pearls glinting under the fluorescent lights, and said, "We've had complaints about the size of Mr. Carter's property. It does not conform to the visual standard of our community." Complaints. I hadn't even been there long enough for anyone to know my name. I looked around the room at the neighbors, many of whom avoided my eyes. A few smirked. And then Karen turned to me and said, "We'll need you to submit plans to bring your home into compliance." I laughed, thinking she was joking, but she wasn't. Compliance with what? I asked. This house has been here for years. It was good enough before. Why isn't it good enough now? Karen's lips tightened. The community has grown. Standards have changed. You're expected to make adjustments so your property reflects the values of this neighborhood. Adjustments. That was her word for it. As if I could magically wave a wand and add square footage to a house overnight. When I walked out of that meeting, I realized I wasn't just dealing with nitpicking neighbors. This HOA wasn't about maintaining lawns or keeping things clean. It was about control. Over the next few weeks, letters kept coming. First, it was recommendations that I consider adding an additional floor. Then it escalated to threats of fines for non-compliance. I could hardly believe it. They were treating my home like it was some kind of eyesore when all I wanted was to live in peace. One evening, as I stood in my driveway looking at my house, frustration boiling inside me, I made a decision. If they thought my house was too small, I'd make it bigger. But I wouldn't just expand it, I'd make sure the addition hit them where it hurt the most. And that's when I started looking at the HOA clubhouse across the street. Perfectly positioned with its big windows, facing the sunset. They loved their view. They boasted about it at every meeting. And I thought to myself, what if my new extension just happened to take that view away? It wasn't just about compliance anymore. It was about turning their own rules against them. If they wanted bigger, they were about to get bigger, far bigger than they could handle. The very next morning, I called up an architect I knew through a friend. His name was Dean Sharpguy, creative and not afraid to push boundaries. I explained the situation, laid out the HOA's nonsense about my house being too small, and then told him what I wanted. An extension, I said, grinning, big enough to shut them up, and positioned so it, well, just happens to block the clubhouse view. Dean raised an eyebrow. "You're serious?" As a heart attack. He chuckled and leaned back in his chair. "You know, Most people call me because they want to add a bedroom or expand their kitchen. You're the first person asking for an extension as revenge. Call it compliance with a purpose, I replied. Within a week, Dean had drafted up plans for a sleek 2-story addition to the back of my house. It wasn't just functional, it was beautiful. It's a new sunroom, an extended kitchen, and an upstairs balcony overlooking the yard. It would increase my square footage well beyond what the HOA claimed I lacked. And the best part? The bulk of the new structure perfectly aligned with the clubhouse windows. Their prized sunset view, gone. I submitted the plans to the HOA, just as they had demanded. At the next meeting, I stood up and handed the documents to Karen with a smile. "I'm taking your advice," I said sweetly. "I'll be expanding the house to meet the community standards. These are the plans." Karen's face went pale as she flipped through the pages. This addition is huge." "Exactly," I said. "You wanted bigger, you're getting bigger." The room erupted into whispers. A few board members leaned over to peek at the drawings. One even muttered, "That's going to block." The clubhouse, Karen cleared her throat, glaring at me. "We'll need to review this thoroughly. Don't start construction until you receive formal approval." But I was ready for that. I knew their tricks. Before I submitted the plans, I had already checked with the city's zoning office. Everything was by the book. Setbacks met. Height restrictions complied. Safety codes all clear. The city had already approved my permits, so while the HOA dragged their feet, I broke ground. The sound of hammers and saws filled the neighborhood, and I can't describe the satisfaction I felt watching the foundation take shape. Neighbors slowed their cars as they drove by, some cheering me on quietly, others looking horrified. Every day, the structure grew taller, wider, and more imposing. And every day, Karen stood across the street, arms crossed, watching like a hawk dot by. The time the frame reached the second floor, it was obvious what was happening. From the clubhouse, their perfect line of sight was gone, replaced by beams and plywood. One evening, I overheard a group of board members complaining in the parking lot. "Our view is ruined." One of them groaned. "That's exactly the point," I thought, smiling to myself. Karen wasn't about to take it lying down, though. She showed up at my house, knocking on the door like she owned it. "You can't just build whatever you want," she snapped when I opened the door. I leaned against the frame. "Actually, I can. Everything has been approved by the city. I'm fully compliant." Her face reddened. "This is against the spirit of the community guidelines." "Funny," I said, "'cause I'm following every rule you've demanded. You wanted my house bigger. Now it's bigger. Isn't that what you asked for?" She sputtered, searching for words before storming off. That night, as the crew packed up, I stood in the yard and looked at the nearly completed shell of the extension. It wasn't just a house anymore, was a statement. But deep down, I knew. Karen wouldn't give up, and I was right. Because within days, she tried something even bolder. She attempted to get the city to revoke my permit. Karen was nothing if not persistent. The moment she realized my extension was going up faster than she could gossip about it, she marched herself down to the city's zoning office. She filed complaint after complaint, claiming my project violated everything from community harmony to historical aesthetics. The city inspector showed up one afternoon while my construction crew was busy putting up the exterior walls. He looked almost embarrassed as he approached me. "Listen," he said, flipping through his clipboard. "We've got a flood of complaints from your HOA president. I just need to verify that your permits are in order." I walked him into my office, where a neatly organized folder sat on the desk. Inside were stamped approvals, zoning clearances, and signed permits, all legitimate. I handed them over with a grin. "Take your time," I told him. "You'll find everything in perfect order." Sure enough, after 20 minutes of double-checking, he closed the folder and sighed. "You're clean? Karen's wasting everyone's time." That was music to my ears. The very next day, Karen stormed over while the crew hammered away at the roof beams. Her face was red, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You tricked the city." She barked. "Tricked them?" "No. Followed the law." "Yes," I replied calmly. "Maybe you should try it sometime." Her jaw dropped. She sputtered a few more threats, then stormed back to the clubhouse. I could practically hear her scheming through the walls. The funny thing was, not everyone in the neighborhood shared her outrage. In fact, more and more of my neighbors started stopping by during construction. One elderly man, Mr. Howard, leaned on his cane as he admired the frame. "You know," he said, chuckling, "I've hated the way that clubhouse hogged the view. For years, they act like it belongs to them, not us." Another neighbor whispered, "We're rooting for you. Karen's been lording over everyone for too long." That gave me strength. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone who'd been bullied into silence by her ridiculous power plays. When the siding finally went up, the clubhouse members had no choice but to face the reality. Their view was gone. Completely, gloriously gone. From their prized balcony, all they could see now was the side of my beautiful new extension, complete with tall windows that glimmered in the sunset they once claimed as their own. Karen, however, wasn't finished. At the next HOA meeting, she stood up with a stack of papers in her hands. "This homeowner has engaged in malicious construction," she declared dramatically. I motioned to fine him for obstructing community amenities. The room went quiet. Then, to her shock, a few members actually spoke up against her. "This isn't malicious," one man said. "He followed the rules. Maybe we should be more careful about how we enforce them." Another woman added, "Frankly, I think the extension looks beautiful. It raises property values." Karen's face twisted like she'd just swallowed something. Bitter, but she still pushed her motion forward, and when the vote was called, the result was close but not in her favor. The motion failed. I caught Karen's eyes across the room. She looked like she might actually explode. But even then, I knew she wasn't done. The more I embarrassed her, the more dangerous her retaliation would become. And sure enough, within weeks, she escalated in a way that shocked everyone. She filed a lawsuit claiming my extension caused emotional distress to the HOA board. When I received the thick envelope stamped with summons, I nearly laughed out loud. Karen had actually gone there. She filed a lawsuit claiming my extension had irreparably harmed the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood and, get this, caused emotional trauma to the board members who could no longer enjoy the sunset view from their clubhouse balcony. Emotional trauma over a view. It sounded like a bad sitcom. But the reality was, a lawsuit meant I had to take this seriously. I hired a lawyer, an old friend of mine named Marcus, who'd dealt with HOAs before. When I showed him the paperwork, he shook his head in disbelief. "This is flimsy at best," he said. "They're trying to bully you with legal jargon, but they have no case. You followed city code. You followed HOA rules. If anything, we should countersue." Karen must have thought her dramatic courtroom showdown would go in her favor. She strutted into that courthouse like she was about to crown herself queen of the neighborhood. She had binders, photos of the clubhouse, even testimony from her little inner circle about how much they missed the sunset view. When it was our turn, Marcus calmly laid out every permit, every approval, every signature from the city. He pointed out that not only had I followed the HOA guidelines, but the rules actually encouraged homeowners to improve their properties. He even quoted their own handbook against them. Then came the twist. Marcus introduced testimonies from neighbors who supported me. Mr. Howard testified that the clubhouse had monopolized the view for years. and my extension leveled the playing field. Another family admitted they were glad someone finally stood up to Karen. Karen tried to interrupt, object, and shout over them, but the judge wasn't having it. At one point, she actually slammed her hands on the table and yelled, "But it ruins our sunsets." The judge raised an eyebrow. This is a court of law, not a spa. Losing a view does not constitute legal damages. When the gavel finally came down, the lawsuit was dismissed. Karen's face drained of color, but the story didn't end there. Because not only was her case dismissed, Marcus had filed a counterclaim for harassment and frivolous litigation. The court agreed to hear it. That meant Karen wasn't just walking away empty-handed. She was about to face financial consequences for dragging me into court over nothing. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. For years, Karen had bullied homeowners with threats of fines, violations, and lawsuits. But now, for the first time, she was the one on the defensive, and people were starting to realize she wasn't as powerful as she pretended to be. The counterclaim against Karen was the turning point. For once, she wasn't in control of the narrative. She couldn't hide behind HOA bylaws. She couldn't intimidate with empty threats. She was being dragged into the very system she had weaponized against everyone else. When the hearing began, Marcus laid it out plainly. Karen had abused her position as HOA president, filing baseless complaints and lawsuits that wasted time, money, and resources. He showed the court the string of violation letters, the endless warnings, and the absurd escalation to a lawsuit over sunsets. Karen tried to defend herself, claiming she was protecting the neighborhood's character, but the judge wasn't impressed. He pointed out that the HOA handbook never gave her authority to police home sizes that had already been approved decades earlier. In fact, she'd been selectively enforcing rules against homeowners she personally didn't. Like Dot, the judgment came down hard. Karen was ordered to pay for my legal fees and a fine for filing a frivolous lawsuit. It wasn't bankruptcy-level money yet, but for her, it was devastating. The fallout spread like wildfire. Word got out that Karen had lost in court and that she'd cost the HOA thousands in legal expenses. Neighbors who'd once feared her now turned against her. At the next HOA meeting, the room was buzzing with whispers. When Karen tried to take her usual seat at the front, she was met with crossed arms and cold stares. One member finally stood up and said, "We're done letting you run this community into the ground." A vote was called. In less than 5 minutes, Karen was removed as HOA president. Her reign of control was over. But here's where the twist came. Karen didn't just lose her position. Without her constant threats, people began speaking up about the shady ways she'd managed HOA funds. A deeper look revealed that she had been skimming money from HOA dues for years, funneling it into her own projects. The discovery forced her into yet another lawsuit, this time criminal. By the end of it, Karen wasn't just disgraced. She was bankrupt, selling off her house to pay restitution. As for me, my extension stood tall, a symbol of what happens when you stand up to bullies. My neighbors began stopping by not just to admire the addition, but to thank me. Many admitted they'd wanted to fight back for years, but didn't think it was possible. I smiled every time I looked across the street at the clubhouse. No one was sipping wine on that balcony anymore, because the view they once flaunted as theirs alone was gone, and it was never coming back. What started as their attempt to belittle my too small house had ended with Karen's empire crumbling to dust. My home wasn't just big enough now, it was untouchable. And that's how the HOA president who claimed my house was too small lost everything while I gained the peace of mind I deserved. Sometimes, the bullies who shout the loudest forget that the rules they use to control others can turn right back on them. Karen thought she could push me into submission, but instead, she ended up losing her power, her reputation, and even her home. If there's one lesson here, it's this: never let anyone make you feel small, especially not in your own home. Stand tall, fight smart, and remember, sometimes the best view is the one you build for yourself.